3.5 hours. Mr. Nasrallah, who's, Mr. Spar has read a lot about him and his Hezbollah party, is about to take the stage to give a speech. So the context is ominous or relevant. So welcome to him.
Thanks very much, Charles, and good morning to everybody. So first of all, I should beg your indulgence for the following reason. I'm not, unlike many of the other speakers at our conference, a university lecturer by profession, and nevertheless I have attempted for this session to write something which I thought or think resembles a lecture as it should be given by a university lecturer. So it may be that, or it may be something else. We're about to find out, I guess. Antisemitism in the contemporary Middle East and political Islam is the focus of my talk today. And what I'm going to do is look into the background and then apply the background to two specific anti-Semitic movements of political Islam, namely the Palestinian Hamas and the Lebanese Hezbollah, with an emphasis on the first. So to begin then, let me say that the Middle East today is verifiably the most anti-Semitic region in the world. It is a region in which, perhaps uniquely in contemporary times, negative stereotypes of Jews, including ideas of Jewish conspiracy and nefarious and occult Jewish control of world power centers, exist freely in the cultural mainstream. And one may find manifold examples of these in popular media and cultural production in the modern Middle East. And one need not spend a great deal of time traveling in the Middle East and conversing with local people before making the acquaintance of the rich variety of entirely negative stereotypes and conspiracy theories regarding Jews, which form a central element of mainstream political discussion in the region. So what I want to try and do in this talk is to look into the nature and reasons for the pervasiveness and near ubiquitousness of anti-Semitism in the current Middle East. And I want to then, as I said, consider the position and role of political Islam in regard to this matter. First of all, though, some evidence for the claim of the ubiquitous presence of anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East. A poll undertaken by the respected Pew Research Center for its Pew Global Attitudes project in 2010 looked into attitudes toward Jews in a variety of countries, both in the Middle East and outside of it. And it found the following statistics. In Lebanon, fully 97% of those surveyed had an unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Jews. This included 99% of both the Sunni and Shia Muslims. The 97% figure derived from the slightly less unfavorable view among Lebanese Christians and Druze. In Egypt, the figures were 95% with unfavorable or very unfavorable views to 3% with favorable or very favorable views. In Jordan, the figures were 96% to 3%. The 2010 poll showed a slight increase in levels of hostility to Jews compared to a poll taken 2 years earlier. But in the poll of 2008, the figures for all three had shown, in any case, more than 95% of respondents having either an unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Jews. In non-Arab Muslim countries, the levels of unfavorable views were lower, though still striking. In Turkey, for example, the survey found the percentage expressing either, once again, unfavorable or very unfavorable attitudes was 76% against only 7% having a favorable or very favorable view. In Pakistan, the figures were 76% to 4%. In Indonesia, the figures were 66% to 10%. For the purpose of comparison of the countries polled, those with the highest number of favorable or very favorable attitudes to Jews were the US, UK, and France, with 77, 73, and 79% respectively. The empirical evidence for the current near ubiquitousness of anti-Semitic attitudes in the Arab countries bordering Israel then is clear and very striking. Middle East historian Bernard Lewis wrote that by the 1980s, the volume of anti-Semitic literature published in the Arab world and its wide audience and the apparent authority of its sponsors suggested, in Lewis's view, that classical anti-Semitism of the formerly Western type had become an essential part of Arab intellectual life, considerably more, in his estimation, than in late 19th or early 20th century France, and in his view, at a level comparable to that of Germany in the 1930s. But while the evidence for the current pervasive presence of anti-Semitism in the Middle East is then overwhelming, interpreting its cause is more complex. Broadly, two schools exist which seek to account for it, which I'm going to call here the modernist and the perennialist schools. The modernist school holds that anti-Semitism is a phenomenon emerging from the Western Christian world. And this view considers that while Jews undoubtedly experienced a legally subordinate status in the Muslim world, this did not traditionally translate into widespread persecution and hatred. Rather, the relatively small and entirely powerless Jewish communities of the Muslim world were, in this view, a matter of little concern and attention throughout most of the period following the establishment of Islam and its conquest of the Middle East. Indeed, according to this view, the protected or dhimmi status afforded Jews throughout this period offered them a measure of physical security and protection often not available in the Christian world of the contemporary period. According to this view, then, anti-Semitism of the ideological and virulent type began to grow and spread in the Muslim world with the encroachment of Western ideas and Western power in the 19th century and the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire and traditional Islamic society and the conflict between Jews and Arabs over Israel, Palestine, according to this view, then greatly exacerbated anti-Jewish feeling. Esther Webman, for example, a proponent, I would say, of this school, wrote in 1994 that, and I quote, "Anti-Semitism did not exist in the traditional Islamic world. It is, in fact, a relatively new phenomenon, gaining ground particularly since the eruption of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the mid-20th century." The perennialist view, by contrast, holds that this interpretation fails to take account of the sometimes virulent discrimination and the examples of persecution and murder experienced by Jews prior to the coming of the West in modern times to the Middle East. And these views seek to undermine the view commonly heard of a golden age of Islamic tolerance in the High Middle Ages between 950 and around 1250 in, for example, Islamic Spain of the Middle Ages. And they do so by producing counterexamples of prejudice and violence against Jews in that period. They also, this perennialist view, sometimes seeks to locate the roots of anti-Semitism in the Middle East within the texts and praxis of Islam itself, noting examples of anti-Jewish sentiment in the Quran and the Hadith. So which of these interpretations fits best with the available historical record? Observation of the evidence, I guess unsurprisingly, suggests that the distinction, while of some explanatory power, is a somewhat artificial one, since both explanations contain elements that have explanatory power regarding the present situation, as I will now go on to try and illustrate with a brief whistle-stop tour through the history of Jews in the Islamic world. Back to the source. Islam clashed with the Jews from its earliest period. Three Jewish tribes famously lived in Medina. These were at the time coterminous with the life of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. These were the Banu Nadir, the Banu Qaynuqa, and the Banu Qurayza. The third one, of course, you've probably heard of. Other Jews lived throughout the oasis areas of northern Arabia. Little is known of these Jewish tribes in terms of the historical record, and sometimes scholars refer to them as Judaized Bedouin, in the sense that they appear to have differed in no significant way from the surrounding population and to have formed generally an accepted element of society. And the conflict between these tribes and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, begins with his migration, of course, from Mecca to Medina, where the Jewish tribes reject his apostolate and resist his political and military leadership, according to the Islamic sources. And this conflict results in Muhammad's defeat of the Jewish tribes and the extermination of one of them, the Bani Qurayza. And in the Quran, Hadith and Sunnah, the Jews of Medina are depicted as stubborn, rebelling against the commandments of God, seeking to kill his messengers. The Quran, for example, Surah 5, verse 82 states, quote, famously, I'm sure many of you have heard this quote before, "You will surely find that the people most hostile to the believers are the Jews and the pagans." However, classical Islamic literature treats these episodes as fairly minor events in the history of Muhammad, which in any case ended, notably, with the complete defeat of the Jews. According to Surah 2, verse 61 in the Quran, they were afflicted with humiliation and poverty, and they felt the wrath of God. This was because they used to disbelieve the signs of God and kill his messengers unjustly. This was because they disobeyed and transgressed. Following Muhammad's death, from the period 632 to 661, Arab Muslim forces launched successful attacks against the Byzantine and Persian empires, adding territory to their emergent empire. This period led, of course, by Muhammad's successors, the first four caliphs, who were both religious and political leaders. This is where the emergent world of Islam, or sphere of Islam, clearly comes into historic contact with traditional or notable Jewish communities, because during the 7th century, the majority of Middle Eastern Jewry lived within the Byzantine Empire, whose territory included what are now Syria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. Many of these communities had been residing in cities such as Aleppo since biblical times under various rulers. Byzantine policy, by the way, dictated that all non-Christians, including the Jews, were burdened with high taxes and strict religious restrictions. There was also tremendous pressure to convert to Christianity in order to avoid religious persecution. Groups of Jews also remained in Persia, suffering equally from the stringent rule of the Sassanid Empire, which was, of course, the Byzantine Empire's great historical rival at this time. Both the Byzantines and the Sassanids had failed to anticipate the full capacity of the Arab force coming out of southern Arabia. And they were caught by surprise. They were at that time all but exhausted from decades of war with one another, and Muslim victory was quick and complete. So with the conquest by Islam of areas outside of the Hijaz, outside of southern Arabia, large number of ancient Jewish communities come under Islamic rule for the first time. And the first and second pacts of Omar, which I think many people here probably are familiar with, named, of course, after the second caliph of Islam, and Omar II, the Umayyad caliph, respectively, first codified the conditions under which Jews and Christians were to live under Islam. In parenthesis, let me note that whether the pact truly dates back to these venerated figures, or whether it was in fact introduced by later jurists who used these men's names to add authority to the document, remains a matter of discussion. But in any case, the pact the pact lays down the basic text defining relations between Muslims and the Ahl al-Kitab, the peoples of the book, namely Christians and Jews under Islamic rule. Worth then taking a little bit of a look at the pact itself and its details. According to the Pact of Omar, Jews and Christians were granted the right to practice their own religious rites. Protection of Christians and Jews and their property was part of the pact. Manifesting their religion, we have canned applause is all good. Canned laughter less so, canned applause is good. Manifesting their religion publicly, however, or converting anyone to it was prohibited, as was keeping their children from becoming Muslim. Jews and Christians were required to wear clothing or signs that differentiated them from Muslims. The public sphere would be a completely Islamic environment, so dhimmis were prohibited from building or repairing places of worship without the permission of Muslim rulers. Their places of worship could not be as high as mosques, and bells and the public display of crosses on churches were banned for Christians. To secure their rights, non-Muslims would pledge loyalty to their Muslim rulers and pay a special poll tax, the famous jizya, for adult males. Their testimony in court was not equal to that of a Muslim. The Jews could not bear arms or even ride a horse. This remains relevant for not only historical discussion, because many of the conditions of the Pact of Omar are still upheld as the ideal model for the treatment of non-Muslims among Orthodox classic Muslim theologians. The conditions of the pact were authoritative. The level of enforcement varied, however, as shown in many historical examples. For example, by the existence of churches constructed long after the Muslim conquests in contravention of the strict terms of the Pact of Omar. In practice, at least up to the 13th century, many regulations were not strictly enforced. And by the way, this is even particularly so with regard to Jews when compared to Christians. As I say, we can find examples where Jews are generally able to integrate to Muslim lands better than comparable Christian communities. So you can think of in early Muslim Spain, for example, any dress restrictions for Jews are not visible. Jews dress in fine apparel. Many of them are economically successful. Also, with regard to evidence from the Cairo Geniza, shows us that during the Fatimid dynasty's rule in Egypt, 969 to 1171 CE, Jews are frequently able to be professionally successful, also in the public sphere, to get involved with the Fatimid government system, and so on and so forth. But of course, the relatively peaceful life available to Jews as dhimma was dependent on their remaining obedient. And the history of the period is replete with examples of the unfortunate fate of Jews who were perceived as having transgressed or got above themselves. The writings by Jews from that period in the Cairo Geniza use a specific term, sinut, to refer to hostility from local Muslims towards Jews. And the resentment over the appointment of Jews to positions of authority very occasionally spilled over during this period into outright violence. I want to quote now from a contemporary poem by one Abu Ishaq, who himself helped to incite a pogrom in Granada in the year of 1066. He writes, "Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill them. The breach of faith would be to let them carry on. They have violated our covenant with them, so how can you be held guilty against the violators?" Here we find a manifestation of a distinct brand of Islamic anti-Semitism, in my estimation, or anti-Jewish prejudice, if we prefer, which differs from its Western counterpart. It holds to the central view that the Jews are the most hostile to Islam's revelations among humanity and are also prone to treachery in dealings with others, prone to arrogant self-righteousness, to slaying Allah's messengers and prophets, and other forms of evil conduct. A contemporary chronicle, contemporary I mean to the Granada massacre, written by Sultan Abdullah of Granada in 1073, for example, describes this massacre of between 3,000 and 4,000 Jews in December 1066. According to Abdullah, quote, "Both the common people and the nobles were disgusted by the cunning of the Jews, the notorious changes they had wrought in the order of things, and the positions they occupied in violation of their pact," that's to say the Pact of Omar. Allah decreed their destruction on Saturday, December 31st, 1066, and he goes into some detail. The Jew, Yosef ibn Nagrela, fled into the interior of the palace, but the mob pursued him there, seized him, and killed him. They then put every Jew in the city to the sword and took vast quantities of their property. Close quotes. It's noteworthy that the massacre of the Jews of Granada led to more deaths of Jews, numerically, than the destruction by the Crusaders of the Jewish communities of the Rhineland 30 years earlier at the outset of the First Crusade. Such outbreaks of violence were nevertheless the exception rather than the rule, and as we see with the example of Granada, they took place usually relating to a sense that the Jews had got above themselves, or sometimes also to an external threat, which then increased the level of paranoia and suspicion of the Jewish population. In general, Jews and Christians under Muslim rule were not subject to physical expulsion. The one obvious exception to this rule is Arabia itself, where Caliph Omar expelled all Jews and Christians from Hijaz area, in line with the hadith that two religions shall not remain in the land of the Arabs. But again, in significant ways, the life of Jews under Muslim rule at that time did compare favorably with their lives in Christian Europe. Jews were rarely forced to change their religion. Unlike in Europe, they were rarely confined in territorial or occupational ghettos, with some exceptions in Iran and Morocco specifically. They enjoyed freedom of worship and some autonomy in communal affairs. And while formally subject to a whole series of legal, fiscal, and political disabilities, the application of these varied from time to time and from place to place. So in other words, the situation affecting Jewish and Christian minorities in the High Middle Ages falls, of course, far short of the standard set in modern times in modern democracies, but it compares favorably in many aspects with conditions prevailing in Western Europe at the time. It did not last, however. The relative tolerance afforded to Jews and Christians, remember, was dependent on their not being perceived as a threat. The view of the Jew as a defeated foe in Islam is key here. In the Islamic, as in the Christian, foundational narratives, the Jew is a hostile and malevolent force. But unlike in the Christian context, the Jew's malevolence ends in his defeat. As Lewis puts it, and I quote from him again, this basic difference between the Jew's success against Christ and his failure against Muhammad had a decisive influence on the attitudes of the Jew haters of the two religions. For the Christian Jew haters, the Jew represented a dark and deadly power, capable of deeds of cosmic evil. For the Muslim, he might be hostile, cunning, and vindictive, but he was weak and ineffectual, an object of ridicule rather than fear. This lack of dangerousness attributed to the Jews in the Muslim world worked in their favor. But of course, it did so only in periods when the Muslim host community felt itself sufficiently secure. As the Muslim world came to feel itself increasingly weak, put upon and surrounded, so it became increasingly suspicious of the non-Muslim communities in its midst, and their situation began correspondingly to decline. If we observe, for example, the harshly discriminatory policy of the Berber Almoravids, who arrived in Spain in 1086, and then the even more fanatical Almohad Berber Muslims after 1146 in Spain, it becomes clear that any notion of a golden age for Jews in Muslim Andalusia is largely a myth. The Almoravids directed their depredations mainly against the Christian dhimmi population, but the Almohads carried out also widespread slaughter of Jews. That dynasty, again, many I think are familiar with this, and it's interesting, abolished the Pact of Omar. They abolished the dhimmi system, and they gave Jews, therefore, the choice of excuse me, the choice of a conversion, exile, or death in the areas that they conquered. The famous Jewish philosopher and physician Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, was forced to flee the Almohads with his family. Yet it should also be noted that Maimonides did not seek refuge in the Christian world, where at this time he could in fact in no way have expected significantly better treatment. Famously, he made his way to Egypt, where he became a physician at the court of Salah ad-Din. So to sum up, then, the position of the Jews under Islam from its inception is one of institutionalized legal inferiority. This inferiority had no exception, but its implementation varied from place to place and time to time. The harshness of Muslim rule tended to correlate with the level of confidence and security felt by the Muslim rulers and their community. Where they felt reason to suspect their Jewish or Christian subjects, so the harshness of their rule tended to increase. As the confidence of the Muslim dominion began to subside, as enemies attacked its borders, so its tolerance of non-Muslim minorities declined. And as the Muslim world begins to become influenced by Western ideas, so Western anti-Semitism, or the Western anti-Semitic style, begins to appear among Muslim communities. And this introduced a new virulence and new motifs into the view of the Jews prevalent in the region. The arrival of the distinctive Christian type of hostility to Jews came into the Islamic world in several stages. It began in the High Middle Ages, with Christian converts to Islam. The second stage came with Ottoman expansion into Europe, which brought large numbers of Greek Orthodox Christians under Muslim rule. And the blood libel was endemic in these areas and came to the notice of the Ottoman authorities through the disturbances this tended to cause at Easter time. And this was the first time that this particular variant had been known in Muslim lands. And in the course of the 19th century, accusations of ritual murder began to become almost commonplace, cropping up all over the empire, most famously, of course, in Damascus in 1840. The real penetration, indeed, of modern-style anti-Semitism into the region we're discussing comes in the 19th century. It began among the Christian Arab minorities, who had the closest contacts, of course, with the West. The Christians, and it's important to note this, had economic and commercial as well as religious reasons for opposition to the Jews, who were their commercial competitors. And during the 19th century, the first Arabic translations of European anti-Semitic writings begin to be published, mainly from original texts in French. The very first, at least that we are aware of, was a tract published in Beirut in 1869, purporting to be the work of a Moldavian rabbi who had converted to Christianity. The work detailed the various supposed horrors of Jewish ritual practice and the Jewish religion. And the introduction of the Talmudic theme in Muslim anti-Jewish polemics, also, of course, very visible still today, dates from this period, and it derives from Christian sources. Of course, the entry of Christian-style anti-Semitism into the Muslim world in the 19th century was not taking place in a vacuum. Rather, it formed part of a larger picture in which the Christian West, having overtaken the Muslim world in terms of societal and technological development, was now beginning to physically encroach upon the domains of Islam. By the beginning of the 20th century, much of the Islamic world had been conquered by, or was in the process of being conquered by, the European empires. And two related movements arose to combat this Western advance in the Middle East. These, of course, were Arab nationalism and political Islam. Each of these movements claimed to represent the authentic response of the region to Western incursion. But each, also in its own way, was deeply influenced by Western ideas. Arab nationalism, through such writers as Sati al-Husri, and later Michel Aflach and Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, adopted the German-style, romantic and organic type of nationalism. Islamism also bears, in my estimation at least, many of the hallmarks of a nationalist revival movement, albeit one which sees the Islamic Ummah as the community which has been invaded and which needs to revive its authentic consciousness and practices in order to resist and fight back against invasion. These movements emerged in the ferment of the early 20th century. They were coterminous with the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism, or Zionism. And though rivals to one another, both Arab nationalism and Islamism are deeply permeated with anti-Jewish ideas and images in their literature and propaganda. The rise and triumph of Zionism and the emergence of the State of Israel represent a core trauma for the Islamic world in modernity. As we have seen earlier in the lecture, the traditional Islamic view of the Jews is one which might be described as contemptuous, but also largely indifferent. The Jews were a subaltern people with a clear, if inferior, place in Islamic society. That such a people had successfully rebelled against this status, and by doing so had even defeated Arab armies and re-established themselves in their ancient homeland, a place also of high importance to the Muslim and Arab worlds, represented a calamity of the first order. The reversal of this situation remained and remains a matter of immense importance for millions throughout the Islamic world. So the establishment of Israel constitutes a focal point for the coming together of a number of elements of central importance in the contemporary Islamic world. The sense of humiliation at the hands of the Christian West is personified most strongly in the victory of the Jews on Islamic soil over Muslims. This sense of humiliation and the desire for revenge is fueled, paradoxically, by the permeation of traditionally Christian ideas regarding the Jews as a noxious and powerful enemy into the Muslim world as a result of Western encroachment. Such ideas were alien to traditional Islamic society, as we've seen, but the Muslim world today is the place in which they most flourish, while such ideas have, or at least had until the very recent period, retreated to the fringes in the West, the place of their origin. You take some examples now of the way in which this reflects itself in terms of the current Islamic and Arabic space. The Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna conceived a view of the Jews and of Zionism as a sort of occult cosmic force against which it was a holy duty to fight. And these ideas remain manifest today and can be found among speakers or writers loyal to the Muslim Brotherhood trend. One example, famously well known in Israel, is the statement of the Israel-based Islamist leader Raed Salah, probably familiar to some people here, who after 9/11, after the terror attacks of 9/11, wrote that the one responsible for this act was, now I'm quoting Raed Salah, the unique mover who wanted to carry out the bombings in Washington and New York in order to provide the Israeli establishment with a way out of its entanglements. And the unique mover found a suitable way to warn the 4,000 Jews who worked at the World Trade Center so they would not come to work on September 11th, 2001. But these ideas of the Jews as a unique and powerful cosmic occult force have not come at the expense of the traditional Muslim view of the Jew. Rather, the two have joined together in contemporary usage, combining into the image of the Jew, commonly presented in the Islamic world today, as simultaneously powerful and yet unworthy of the respect that usually might be expected to come with the possession of power. Violent and yet cowardly, and equally paradoxically, familiar, indeed perhaps eternal, and yet also somehow inauthentic. This complex of ideas, drawing from traditional Islamic, Christian, and modern secular leftist notions, constitutes the prism through which Jews and Israel are seen today, overwhelmingly in the mainstream of the Arab and Islamic worlds. So both modernist and perennialist explanations of anti-Semitism in the modern Middle East contain elements of truth. The virulent anti-Semitism in evidence in the Middle East today is indeed of fairly recent vintage, dating back to the 19th century. It is indeed the product of the Islamic world's encounter with the West and its sense of subjugation, felt perhaps most strongly and acutely in the example of the emergence and flourishing of Israel. But this sentiment is rooted in and makes sense only with reference to the older Islamic idea of the Jew as a member of an inferior, defeated people. Modern anti-Semitism in the Middle East draws heavily on this heritage of contempt and feeling of superiority. Indeed, as I hinted before, it could cogently be argued that it is precisely the Jew's status traditionally as a despised and somewhat ridiculed figure in the Middle East which makes his current rise and ascendancy a matter of such anguish in large parts of the Middle East, and the restoration of the proper order of things such a matter of urgency. That this despised figure can rise up demonstrates just how far the Middle East and Islamic world have fallen in the sentiments of millions of Middle Easterners today. And I would suggest that it is this aspect above all others which lends anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East its peculiar fervor and virulence, and which is likely to ensure that it will be with us for a longer time until a radically new way of viewing both recent and older history emerges into the mainstream of the Middle East. Movements of political Islam are dominant in the Arabic-speaking world today, and they both reflect and advocate the near ubiquitous anti-Semitism of the region, which we have noted. And I want to now take some examples from the two movements which I said I'd speak about at the beginning, namely the Palestinian Hamas and the Lebanese Hezbollah organizations. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are openly anti-Jewish movements, and expressions of anti-Semitism are to be found in both the formative documents and in the statements of these movements' leaders. And in both cases, these expressions draw both on perceptions deriving from the Islamic world and from those deriving from the West. Let me quote now from Hezbollah current General Secretary Hassan Nasrallah, who we heard a little bit about earlier on. This is a quote from a speech he gave a few years ago, but reflecting his perspectives, I think. I'm quoting, to quote. "But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us in the Islamic prophecies, and not only in the Jewish prophecies, is that this state of Israel will be established, and the Jews will gather from all parts of the world into occupied Palestine, not in order to bring about the Antichrist and the end of the world, but rather that Allah, the glorified and most high, wants to save you from having to go to the ends of the world, for they have gathered in one place, and there the final and decisive battle will take place." Close quotes. This is Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah speaking in Beirut in 2002, and much of Hezbollah's attitude can be discerned from this quote, I would suggest. The statement and the movement's outlook regarding the Jews manages a kind of seamless combination of anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish sentiment, in which the politicidal ambitions regarding Israel are frankly and unambiguously located within an anti-Jewish worldview. And this worldview, in turn, is theological and essentialist in nature, meaning that Israel is seen as iniquitous in nature, not because it represents a deviation from Jewish doctrines or essence, as in some other anti-Zionist formulations to be found among the Islamic Middle East, but rather because it is the realization of them, as foreseen, according to Nasrallah, in both Islamic and Jewish scripture. Sheikh Naim Qassem, a senior Hezbollah official sometimes described as the second in command of the movement, in his book, Hezbollah, The Story from Within, characterizes the motivations behind Zionism in the following terms, and I quote, "The Zionist project was formed with a focus on religious fanaticism and Semitic prejudice, using the most dreadful of methods to achieve its aims." And elsewhere, "The basic foundation of the racially prejudiced Zionist movement is expansion, an aim supported by religious foundations drawn from the Torah. According to the Torah, Palestine is an inheritance for the people of Israel, whose lives will not stabilize except with the expulsion of Palestine's original inhabitants." Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, one of the chief ideological fathers of Hezbollah, locates this supposed motivation of Zionism within a supposed inherent Jewish desire for power. And Fadlallah writes, "The Jews want to be a world superpower. This racist circle of Jews wants to take vengeance on the whole world for their history of persecution and humiliation. In this light, the Jews will work on the basis that Jewish interests are above all world interests. No one should imagine that the Jews act on behalf of any super or minor power. It is their personality to make for themselves a future world presence." And later, Naim Qassem discusses what he regards as the danger to the Muslims of the region represented by Israel. And this discussion, too, is rooted in an Islamic theological view, which views the Jews as a uniquely cunning and malicious enemy. Naim Qassem in this discussion cites two other figures, each of whom, as we shall see, is essential in understanding Hezbollah's view on Israel and the Jews, namely Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran and the mythical revered figure of the 12th Imam, Imam Muhammad al-Mahdi, whose reappearance in 12er Shia eschatology is meant to trigger the end days. I think I have time, if it interests you. I have the book here, my own copy, and maybe I will just read very briefly from the book, which is worth reading for anybody interested in this stuff. This is Naim Qassem's book. He writes the following. "Regarding the religious obligation, Jerusalem is the birthplace of the prophets and the land on which Prophet Muhammad treaded. Glory to Allah who did take his servant for journey by night from the sacred mosque to the farthest mosque, to Al-Aqsa, whose precincts we did bless in order that we might show him some of our signs. For he is the one who heareth and seeth all things." It is not permissible to squander the land of Muslims or that which is sanctified. Rising to their defense and liberation is a natural obligation for which all Muslims are liable. As Imam Khomeini declared, the extortionist government of Israel, through its tendentious plans for Islamic nations and Muslims, represents a great danger. It is feared that confrontation may become impossible should Muslims show lassitude. Given that the danger is directed at the very essence of Islam, it is the duty of Muslims, and specifically of Islamic states, to take the initiative for the obliteration of this pond of decay with all possible means, and not to decline the mujahideen any assistance towards this end. Herein we have Herein we have the essential components of Hezbollah view on this subject, once more in greater detail, cogently expressed. An essential Jewish identity seen as the causal factor behind Zionism and the establishment of Israel, the location of the understanding of this identity in Islamic texts, and importantly, the location of the resistance to this entity ending in its destruction in a specific 12 Shia eschatology. Amal Saad Ghorayeb, a British Lebanese researcher who is supportive of Hezbollah, in her book Hezbollah, Politics and Religion, best sums this point up in the following terms. I also brought my well-thumbed copy of Amal's book, which I will also very briefly read from. To be clear, Amal Saad's book is particularly notable here because, as I mentioned, she is a supporter of Hezbollah, and you can find her on Twitter, or X as they call it now, probably even as we speak, tweeting energetically in favor of Hezbollah, which is why her views on the Hezbollah attitude towards the Jews are particularly notable. As I say, she's not somebody who's looking to attack the movement unfairly. And Amal writes the following. Bearing these considerations in mind, it becomes easier to discern Hezbollah's attempts to Judaize Zionism and the Israeli state as when it proclaims that the dreams of the Israelites are over. These attempts are also manifest in the party's transference of negative Jewish traits to Zionism and Israeli society. This tendency is best exemplified in one of Nasrallah's diatribes against Israel, and she quotes Nasrallah here saying, "If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice I do not say the Israeli." Nasrallah does not mean that these traits do not apply to the Israeli. For Hezbollah, they define the very essence of the Israeli, but only insofar as he has inherited them from his Judaic background in which they originate. In practice, this conflation of the establishment and existence of Israel with the supposedly nefarious, power-seeking plans of the Jews opens the door to the embrace by Hezbollah of a variety of forms of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic rhetoric, including elements which have no relation of any kind to Hezbollah's own core Shia Islamic outlook. And a perusal of statements by Hezbollah propagandists and leaders quickly shows up a rich harvest of classical anti-Semitic prejudice, indistinguishable in many ways from the traditional language of the European far right, or indeed, in certain circumstances, of the European far left. I have a bunch of these, but maybe I'll, to cut short, not treat you to all of them. But if we think, for example, here's Saad Ghorayeb again, quoting Naim Qasim as saying, "The history of Jews has proven that regardless of the Zionist proposal, they are a people who are evil in their ideas." Hezbollah celebrates Holocaust denial as well. Jews invented the legend of the Holocaust, says Nasrallah on April 9th, 2000. One fatwa or religious edict provided Lebanese Shia drug dealers with a theological base for their business with Western consumers. They say, "We're making drugs for Satan, for America and the Jews. If we can't kill them with guns, so we'll kill them with drugs." And famously, Nasrallah decried Israel as, and I quote, "the descendants of apes and pigs, a few million vagabonds from all over the world, brought together by their Talmud and by Jewish fanaticism. So if we try to locate Hezbollah within our earlier discussion, it can be seen quite quickly that it conforms to the model, whereby it makes use both of Islamic and Western elements in the formation and expression of its anti-Semitic worldview. And if we turn briefly to consider Palestinian Hamas, then first of all we note that this is a movement deriving from the trend already introduced of Hassan al-Banna, of Muslim Brotherhood outlook, with which we have already encountered. And once again, we find a rich harvest of statements confirming this anti-Jewish view, famously in the founding charter of Hamas, which I think people here are all familiar with, and I'll just read quickly the Article 31, which is characteristic of the view adopted, where it says, under the wing of Islam, it is possible for the followers of the three religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, to coexist in peace and quiet with each other. But peace and quiet would not be possible except under the wing of Islam. It is the duty of the followers of other religions to stop disputing the sovereignty of Islam in this region, because the day these followers should take over, there'll be nothing but carnage, displacement, and terror. Or the more blunt and famous Article 7 of the Charter, which reads, famously, I think everybody has heard this before, the hour of judgment shall not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, so that the Jews hide behind trees and stones, and each tree and stone will say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him, except for the Gharqad tree, which is the tree of the Jews. This kind of attitude on the part of Hamas leaders is visible also in statements further along from leaders and propagandists of the movement. Now, I think everybody here may be familiar with the fact that in 2017, Hamas issued a new policy document which did not contain the common sort of overt anti-Semitism previously seen. I would suggest, however, that it's worth looking at and perusing statements by Hamas leaders, also subsequent to the 2017 declaration, because it shows very quickly, and I guess unsurprisingly, that the 2017 declaration did not in fact lead to a significant change in terms of the movement's attitudes and statements regarding the Jews. So, for example, on July 12, 2018, at a rally broadcast on Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV, Hamas official Sheikh Ahmed Baher predicts the cleansing of Palestine of the filth of the Jews and their uprooting from it, Allah willing, and the establishment of the caliphate after the nation has been healed of its cancer, the Jews, Allah willing. On June 23rd, 2019, once again on Hamas's Al-Aqsa TV, Hamas MP Marwan Abu Ras explained about Jews that everything people say about massacres and Holocaust, these are all lies. Hitler may have hated them, but it was because of their deeds and crimes. On May 7th, 2021, once again on the same TV channel, Hamas official Fatih Hamad calls for Palestinians in Jerusalem to cut off the heads of the Jews. And final example, Hamas official Hamad al-Rajib, in an April 2023 sermon, prays for the annihilation and paralysis of the Jews, who he describes as filthy animals. Allah transformed them, he said, into filthy, ugly animals like apes and pigs because of the injustice and evil they have brought about. So we can see fairly clearly that while the new document, the 2017 document, allegedly accepts the idea of a Palestinian state on 1967 lines, this does not mean in any way a change with regard to the movement's attitudes towards Jews. And indeed, the 2017 statement itself, nevertheless, makes clear that its supposed acceptance of a state on these lines does not, and I quote, constitute any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, and it defends armed resistance, stating, the resistance to occupation by all means and methods is a legitimate right guaranteed by divine laws, customs, and international laws. Perusal then of these statements from both Hamas and Hezbollah show the extent to which they fit comfortably into the combined influences which we have located in accounting for the perennial and ubiquitous nature of the antisemitism in the Arabic-speaking Middle East. These are, just to reiterate, references to Islamic tradition and to the traditional Muslim image of the Jew as one both weak and corrupt and characterized by cunning and cruelty in his relations with Muslims. There is the traditional Islamic view that the natural state of affairs and the arrangement which alone can guarantee peace and stability is one in which Islam is dominant and the Jews and Christians subordinated to its rule. But there is also the clear presence of motifs emerging from Western and Christian anti-Semitism, Hamas's reference to the protocols of Elders of Zion, for example, Hezbollah's reference to Jewish plots of world domination. And in all these aspects, both Hamas and Hezbollah can be comfortably located within the mainstream of thinking in the Arabic-speaking world regarding Jews and regarding Israel. And it's thus important to understand these movements and those similar to them throughout the region as existing within the historic current of thought in the region in this regard and not against it. This is important in order not to fall victim to illusions regarding potential pragmatic coexistence with these organizations and the ideas they represent, which have served in the past to produce faulty policy, sometimes with tragic results. Lastly, and just briefly, we should remind ourselves that Hamas and Hezbollah, of course, are not debating clubs, and therefore that the perceptions we are discussing or outlining here today have practical results. Hezbollah in particular, because of its more international range of activity, has frequently demonstrated that its war and its actions are directed against Jews as a whole, and not only against Israeli Jews, and still less only against Israeli Jewish soldiers. And let me just give a couple of examples of this, which may be of interest. All the way back to the very early days of its existence, famously, in 1985, Hezbollah kidnapped 9 Jews in Beirut, including Yitzhak Sasson, the leader then of the Jewish community, and Dr. Eli Halak, the doctor of the community. These men were taken from their homes or from traveling to their homes. Sasson was taken from the Beirut International Airport, returning from Abu Dhabi. They were murdered. Their bodies have never been found. The most catastrophic attack of Hezbollah until today was, of course, the July 18th, 1994 vehicle-borne suicide bombing at the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina. 86 people killed, more than 300 injured, and notably a target of a Jewish community, nothing to do with an Israeli context. And we know from more recent observation that when choosing targets abroad, Hezbollah operatives routinely undertake hostile reconnaissance against Jewish individuals and community locations worldwide, including in Europe, including in the UK. In October 2019, for example, 2 Iranian operatives pleaded guilty in the US to spying on behalf of Iran, and they were charged with collecting information on Jewish and Israeli targets in the US and on opponents of the Iranian regime. One of these operatives undertook hostile reconnaissance against Jewish religious and cultural centers in Chicago, taking photographs of the security around one of the buildings. In March 2017, a German court convicted a Pakistani national on charges of spying for Iran's Quds Force or for Hezbollah, or a combination of the two, after he took hundreds of photographs of Jewish and Israeli possible targets for attacks in Germany and in France. So there is a clear praxis on the part of Lebanese Hezbollah of targeting of Jewish facilities, community centers, in addition to those of specifically of the State of Israel itself. Regarding Hamas, it need only be said that the extreme dehumanization of Israeli Jews visible during the massacres of October 7th, 2023, and the demonstrable and audible conflation of Israelis with Jews, as witnessed in much of the recorded speech of the perpetrators on that day, are comprehensible, in my estimation at least, only with reference to the ideas and context which are the subject of this discussion today. So to conclude, let me say that Hamas and Hezbollah represent particular manifestations of a far broader social and political reality in the Arabic-speaking world today. And this reality is that anti-Jewish sentiment in the Arabic-speaking world is near universal. That the particular nature of this sentiment, both because of its roots in older Islamic perceptions of the Jew and in its influence or absorption of Western anti-Semitism, make the idea of accepting the Jew as an equal, and still less as a sovereign neighbor, profoundly difficult in this present period in the region. For this to change, deep change is required within Arab societies themselves. And in the meantime, and on this I will close, if Israeli Jews wish to continue to successfully maintain a non-Islamic, non-Arab sovereign space amid the societal realities described here, the price for the continued flourishing and indeed the basic security of that space will be realism with regard to the phenomena described here and constant vigilance. And on that I will have mercy and close and be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you for an amazing overview. Before we take the questions, I want to ask you a question. By a show of hands, how many here has read the works of some of the Muslim Brotherhood, kind of Islamist intellectuals, like the two, Al-Mana? So I think studying anti-Semitism in 2024 is a very important work because this ideological movement, as we heard from Jonathan, is really paramount now, not only in the Middle East, but in the encampments and in the classrooms of our college universities. So really, we need to understand the ideology of our enemy of democracy and decency.
Jonathan, thank you for utterly depressing, suffocating, depressing, but necessary to be suffocated. And my question is, do we see, can you accelerate the change needed to achieve what you're saying? So are the efforts in the Abraham courts in Saudi Arabia, are we seeing that changing? And the second part of that question is, will we then fast forward to what's happening on campuses today, where they're celebrating Islam? Do they really fully understand? We know they don't understand the river to the sea, but what are the implications then? If things were to change in places like Saudi Arabia and other moderate, more moderate Arab countries, would that change the use of Hamas, Hezbollah type anti-Semitism in the West?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think that, I am encouraged, and I think many of us are, by what I've come to understand is the seriousness of those ideas you're discussing or mentioning with regard to the Gulf at the present time, and specifically with regard to, these are hierarchical societies, so regard to the roles of Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. I personally must tell you I was initially skeptical by much of this, or simply regarded it as plain self-interest on the part of the Gulf monarchs and little more, which is okay as well, but just that. I've come to be a little bit more convinced that they do intend, I'm sure again on the basis of self-interest, but they do wish to present a radically different way of seeing Islam and of seeing the West and of seeing Israel and the Jews even to the people, the publics of the Arabic-speaking world. Whether they will succeed or not is a very big question, and they are only at the very beginning of their attempt. But I think it is a true attempt, and I think that it derives from the fact that the ideas we've been hearing about in the lecture have, of course, produced only catastrophe and disaster for the Arabic-speaking space. They are the main victims of the mistakes inherent in the worldview described here are Arabs themselves. It keeps them mired in poverty, in political failure, in endless war, in endless conflict, endless martyrdom with no end. And I think that Mohammed bin Zayed, particularly, who I think is the deeper thinker of the two, sees that and wants to try to present an alternative to it. And I think that when we begin to see the curricula, for example, also, by the way, the permission for Christian and now Jewish worship as well, down there in the Gulf, we see that something quite profound is going on. Right now, it only really has purchase in the Gulf, in the wealthy, sparsely populated societies of the Arab Gulf or Persian Gulf. To get those ideas out of just the Gulf and into the highly populated, very poor societies of the Levant and of Iraq, which of course is the real task, is only in its absolute infancy, and it's not clear yet whether it will succeed, but I do think it's a sincere attempt, and I think that it's cause for hope, for some tempered optimism. With regard to the second question, do we think that those who are currently demonstrating in favor of Hamas or Hezbollah, whichever it is, or the Houthis, understand any of this? I would tend to give them the benefit of the doubt and suggest that most of them do not. In other words, maybe this is me sort of clutching at straws. No, I think most of the people, the kids who are out there, jumping up and down for this stuff, have no idea about much of the stuff we're discussing here today. And that is not by chance. That is because, in my estimation, they have been miseducated. Western societies have been miseducated regarding the Middle East. And I can tell you, as a graduate of one of the Middle East studies programs in a university in this country from some years ago, it was notable then, and it's yet more notable now, that people through official academic departments are being fed a completely false and spurious, at worst, at best, or at least a partial, version of the ideas prevalent in the Middle East. And these kind of ideas, and people like Al-Banna or people like Fadlallah, are exactly what they're not going to be hearing about. This is simply outside of what passes for education on the Middle East. Why? I would say that this is quite deliberate. In other words, I think that many of there are two reasons. One is who finances these departments, which we shouldn't forget, and we need to look at the amount of Qatari money, for example, which is washing around the study of the Middle East. Up to, by the way, 10, 15, 20 years ago, Saudi money was part of the problem as well, right? So we can think of how things have changed. But the other is not only to do with money, it's to do with the fact that the ideas of those who wish to suppress these realities have won a curious victory, I think, in the ideological or intellectual life of the West. When I studied Middle Eastern studies in the 1990s, and this is not a joke, it's an exact description of reality, if you wanted to end an argument, you could do so by producing a quote from Edward Said. In other words, if I'm saying A and you're saying B, but then I produce a book and say, yeah, but Edward Said writes here that A is correct, there was no available answer to that. You weren't allowed to say, for example, yeah, okay, Edward Said said it, but maybe Edward Said was wrong, right? So the achievement of those who wish to suppress these ideas of a near hegemony in intellectual product on the Middle East and the West is a very profound historic victory that they have achieved. They have the commanding heights of academia, they have the commanding heights of media. To some degree, they even have the commanding heights of policy, though there it's thankfully a more questionable situation. Yeah, they have achieved an intellectual victory, and we need to rally and try to contest the matter once again, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. I'm here. Thank you, Jonathan, for a fascinating, fabulous, and depressing lecture. I would like to respond with an even more depressing question and try to challenge the conversation. Why should we try so hard as non-Middle East experts, as a broader community of intellectuals and scholars, to delve into the pathology of Islamic civilization, Islam, and I'm not going back, maybe it's justifiable to go all the way back to the Pact of Umar, but let's say talk about the Islamic Brotherhood, talk about Hassan al-Banna. If the secular trends in the Arab world have not been better towards Jews, the National Front, Yasser Arafat, Gamal Abdel Nasser, Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad, can we really believe that when we look at their terror attacks, now we're celebrating the Olympic Games in Paris and we can think about 1972 in Munich. These were not Islamic radicals. So in a way, when I look at it, secular Muslims and ultra-religious Muslims disagree about everything except for terrorism, violence towards Jews, hatred of Jews. The question is, how important is this stuff against that background?
Thanks for that. That's a great question. So let me be clear then. I wanted to connect what I wanted in the first part of the lecture to look at as traditional Islamic view of the Jews to movements, Hamas and Hezbollah, with which we're specifically concerned today. I did not wish to suggest, and this is why it's very good that you asked this question, that the problematic views of Islamic society towards the Jews and towards Israel are manifest only in the movements of political Islam. Very much not so. I wanted to discuss them because they're very important today and to give some historical background. But it would be my contention that the so-called secular movements that you mention are equally the product of the history which I discussed in the early part of the lecture. In fact, I think that is another mistake of the way in which the Middle East is taught to us today, or presented also in media, where we are told something like the following: Hamas is the Islamic religious movement, and Fatah is the secular Fatah. You know, Fatah often comes with this accompanying adjective, secular. It's completely misleading, and actually, if to anybody who knows Arabic and has studied Islam a little bit, even in the name of Fatah, it tells you that it is an Islamic movement. What is Fatah? Of course, we know it's an acronym for Harakat Tahrir Palestine, yeah, Palestine Liberation Organization. But actually, Fatah, it means to open, right? It means Islamic conquest. For those of many of you probably know Arabic. I'm sure all of you know Hebrew or some Hebrew, so you know that the same three-letter root for to open in Hebrew, like liftoach, yeah, is the same in Arabic, fataha, to open. But to open is a specific term in Islamic discourse, which means to conquer a country for the purpose of making it Islamic. You open a country for Islam.
Or the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade.
Another good example. So, absolutely. So it tells us that this so-called secular movement is completely steeped in Islamic symbolism as well, no less than is Hamas. Everybody who studies Palestinian national movement's history knows that it was known from the very beginning that George Habash of the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine could never become the leader of the Palestinian movement because his name was George, i.e. he was a Christian. So it means that these so-called secular movements are absolutely steeped in Islam and in Islamic heritage and history and thinking, no less than are the so-called Islamist ones. And we could just as easily do, maybe even, I would say, for me at least, no less interesting lecture where we looked at the history of these movements, the so-called secular movements of Arab world, and located them back also to the same pathologies, as you put it correctly, I think, in the Islamic world. Just I could go on and on, so I won't. But just to give an example, you know, this supposed secular nationalism of the Ba'ath, yeah, of the party of Saddam Hussein and Hafez Assad. It's very fascinating, and not by chance, to note that Michel Aflaq, the founder and chief ideologue of the Ba'ath party, ended his life converting to Islam. Right? He ended his life in Baghdad because he was expelled by his brother Ba'athis in Syria, and he converted to Islam. And it was not by chance, because in many ways this effort at creating a secular Arab nationalism was a kind of agonizing effort by some Arab Christians to try to find their way in the Arab world. And it's very notable that Aflaq at the end of his life abandoned it and just said, no, if I want to have what I want, I have to actually be part of Islam as well. I'm saying this to illustrate that it's impossible to separate these trends from the Islamic heritage and context. And it's very important to state that, so thank you for this question, which enabled me to do so.
I'm going to make one comment and I'll turn it over to Robert. I don't think it's depressing, because I think to know where you are, we know where you're standing, and know what's going on in the context that we're struggling to deal with is positive. So there's a positive element. And another positive element, I'm trying to be Mr. Optimistic here, is all this analysis is really essential, and I think profoundly important, and Jonathan's really truly an expert. But at the same time, we have a war and peace with UAE and Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. There's a rapprochement happening. I think the fact that Iran attacked and Hamas attacked what it did is because it was about to be a significant shift in the region of peace. And I believe there's a war and peace coming, and even if it's not a war and peace, the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran to other Sunni neighbors is enough to bring all sorts of people in good faith together. So there are some positive trends happening or possibly happening, so it's not all horrible.
Thank you, Charles. Jonathan, I always enjoy your talk, and I'm going to add a few observations. If you are okay with that.
Please, yes.
If you want to read, or don't you read my book, I have Salafism. It was published by George University Press. It was, as a matter of fact, reviewed by many Israeli scholars, including Eyal Zisser and other, and I have other book on Hezbollah. But let me make a couple of observations for the sake of history and other things. Something about the Shia is different than the Sunni. The Shia were more, as a matter of fact, more affected by the ideology of Islamism by Khomeini. Khomeini, when he announced his ideology or his concept, wilayat al-faqih, or the rule by the just Jewish, he really said, listen, there is no place for Israel, absolutely not. So really he had some Islamist thought and he added. And this is why he came and he issued Jerusalem Day. Jerusalem Day now is celebrated by Sunni and Shia. Another thing also I would like to say, which absolutely rightly mentioned, the history and everything. I added, as a matter of fact, that will affect Saudi Arabia, what's going to do today. It will affect Qatar and others. And the ideology of Salafism, because these countries, they espouse and they support Salafism. Salafism, other than the Muslim Brotherhood and other than Islamism, mainly it's an ideology that's transnational, and it's present today here in Europe as in the Middle East. Salafism comes from the root word of Salaf, meaning as-Salaf al-Salih, it goes back to the pious ancestor of Islam who lived during the glorious days of Islam. And why I mention this? Because those Salafis would like to create a society today modeled after the one that existed during as-Salaf al-Salih. And this has been extremely, extremely terrible for Europe and for the Middle East. My job was to split this into activists, jihadi, and quietists. Saudi Arabia, until recently, as a matter of fact, supported the Salafi Wahhabi school. In that, it supported all madrasa, with its the ideology. What's happened recently, and this is very important, is that Mohammed bin Salman and others, they are saying, listen, we are supporting only this quietist school, where the quietist school will be only involved, not in politics, it should be apolitics, and then they will deal with social issues. So this is where what's happening, and I hope it will take more, trend in the Arab world. But again, I agree with him, and I agree with Shai. There is an uphill battle, and I am worried, as a matter of fact, as much about Europe as much as the Middle East. And thank you, Charles. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Robert. And I agree with what you're saying. Maybe I can use this as an excuse just to add a bit of detail also regarding the Shia Hezbollah side, in parallel to Robert's correct remarks regarding the Salafis, the Sunni Salafis, because in the initial lecture there wasn't really time just to mention two other elements which I think when understanding Hezbollah you have to also take into account, which are specifically Shia elements which are interesting. One is that the Shia Islam in the Middle East has certain attitudes towards non-Muslims which are not so much present among the Sunnis, specifically the notion of Jews and Christians as being ritually impure. That's to say that they're associated with those phenomena with which Muslims cannot come into contact. And this exists also at theological level, also at popular level. But this, many of you probably who have friends from among Iraqi Jews and Iranian Jews are familiar with this folkloric anecdotes whereby Jews, for example, would not be allowed to go outside in the rain in those countries because it was thought that Jews have some kind of dirty thing on their bodies which will then wash off in the rain, so they have to be kept inside, or of tradesmen throwing away vegetables in the market or fruit after a Jewish person had touched them. This is all very much Shia realities. These had begun to die down by the early 20th century, but Khomeini tried very hard to revive them. You can find in Khomeini's writings this return of the idea that Christians and Jews are ritually unclean. And this is something which I think we also, if we want to understand the peculiar and particular way that Shia political Islam looks at non-Muslims, specifically Jews, we should be aware also of this element. And secondly, very briefly, there is another element which I didn't have time to mention, but it's secondary but notable, is the messianic and eschatological element present in the thinking of Shia political Islam. There's a whole, I guess as Westerners we understand it best to say, there's a kind of there is an end times theology which Hezbollah and those like it adhere to as well, a notion of the return of Imam Mahdi from occlusion, having gone into occlusion in 837, I believe is the year when he was supposedly gone into occlusion, that he will return. And there is a whole kind of end times theology whereby Imam Mahdi will return, and then first of all he'll fight a battle against an Arab ruler called Abu Sufyan, and then afterwards he will fight a battle against a creature called the Dajjal, the kind of antichrist type figure. And there is a rich and disturbing literature in the Shia Islamist trend that the Dajjal is a Jew, that the Dajjal represents Israel, and that therefore there will be a kind of end times apocalyptic war at a certain point between the Muslims and the Dajjal, ending, of course, in the Dajjal's defeat. These are just to fill in the gaps. This is not what they spend every day talking about. But to understand the worldview which we're discussing, we should also be aware of these elements, which don't really have any parallel, by the way, at least as far as I'm aware, in the Sunni political Islamic traditions.
Thank you for your presentation. I want to know about the repression, the repression between Hamas and Iran. There is something which is not clear, because Hamas is from Brotherhood, Sunni, and they had a rapprochement with Shia against Israel or against a radical Islamist movement. But I want to know other thing related with Al-Quds, Masjid Al-Aqsa, and Dome of the Rock. How Iran believe on Al-Aqsa and Masjid Al-Aqsa and Rock of the Dome, and this both mosques are bought by Marwan bin Abd Malik bin Marwan, which is Umayyad, and the enemy of the Shia. I think there's something that is not clear for me.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So this is something which deserves more treatment than I can give it here and now. But let me just, in terms of both of the questions. One is about the rapprochement. Secondly, about the role of Jerusalem and Al-Quds. And these are two separate but related questions. With regard to the rapprochement, first of all, we should understand that the rapprochement is partial and was difficult and was achieved by Hamas, who needed it, with difficulty. I think we mentioned yesterday in our discussion that, when the Arab Spring, so-called, broke out, and Hamas thought, as did many others, including myself, that there was going to be a new power bloc in the region, namely a power bloc of Sunni political Islam centered around Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt and maybe in Turkey, and maybe imminently at that time it looked in Syria as well. When Hamas thought that this bloc was coming into being, they very quickly, without hesitation, left Damascus, abandoned the Iranians, abandoned the Shia, and tried to find their way to what they thought, correctly, had it come into being, would be a much more comfortable and natural political home for them, namely a region-wide, powerful, Muslim Brotherhood-led bloc. Of course, as we know, this bloc did not come into being. General Sisi, we mainly have to thank for that. He removed them, of course, from power in Cairo. Maybe I say it through gritted teeth, but maybe we partially have Bashar Assad to thank as well, because he defeated the uprising in Syria, and so on and so forth. It didn't happen, which meant that Hamas had to find its way back to its former patron, uncomfortable patron, Iran. It has managed to do so, but it took a while. There was a period of time for a few years where Hamas was estranged from Iran. And after all, we should remember that Hamas fighters took part in the Syrian uprising, right? There are examples of Hamas fighters finding their way and fighting for the rebels in Syria against Assad and Iran. So it's a very real point. But, as we know, we do not only live in a world of pure ideas, we live also, actually mainly, in a world of power and of material. And Hamas has found its way back to the Iranians. The Iranians found, for their own purposes, a reason to accept Hamas back into the fold. And so there they are. Nevertheless, I do think we should remember very carefully this aspect that you point out, because I think it does impact on the power realities as well. The way that Iran relates to Hamas compared to the way that it relates to Lebanese Hezbollah is partially a product of the fact that this Hamas is not really a natural partner in quite the same way, certainly not a proxy the way that Hezbollah is. And I think it is maybe of extreme relevance to us even at the moment which we are currently living through, because as we consider whether the Iranians will wish to mobilize the entirety of their regional axis in defense ultimately of Hamas in Gaza, a small and not necessarily centrally important partner, this aspect will have practical application. The Iranians have not entered the fight in full for Hamas, at least partially, because Hamas is an ally, but of a particular kind, Sunni, tried to get away, then it came back. small ally. So this is, I think, very relevant also. Al-Quds, yeah, briefly, you're absolutely right, of course, and people don't know this, and it's something which is worth noting. You know, you see in the terminology of Khomeini and of the Iranian regime, and in the terminology of Lebanese Hezbollah and other Hezbollah movements, a centrality of Al-Quds and Jerusalem. This is something entirely in contradiction with where Shia Islamists traditionally come from, which had no interest in Jerusalem whatsoever. And as you correctly point out, Jerusalem was the center of the Umayyads, that's to say the center of the great enemies of the Shia, much of whom the Shia have some beautiful songs and laments and so on, exactly about how they suffered at the hands of the Umayyads. So this later focus on Jerusalem is completely out of the historic context. Where does it come from? In my own humble opinion, it comes from the fact of modern politics. The Iranians are trying to lead the Arabs against the West. So they're trying to insert themselves into a situation, the loss of Jerusalem to non-Muslims, in which they actually have no legitimate presence at all. But they're doing it because this is the way that politics and power work. Again, thank you for pointing that out. It's something which people need to be aware of, I think.
Jonathan, thank you very much. It was a fascinating presentation, and I congratulate you on the mastery presentation. I have two questions. Question number one, if you were to deliver this presentation in most of the American universities, if you were lucky enough not to be booed out, you'd be at least accused of Islamophobia. And you alluded to this issue, and you stated that you think they won. My question is, do you have any thoughts on how we can launch a fight to try to win this battle? That's question number one. Question number two, we saw in modern times 3 waves which controlled politics in the Middle East. Wave 1 was nationalism. Wave 2 was pan-Arabism. Wave 3, in which we live now, is a kind of a resurgence of Islam, to use a term Bernard Lewis liked to use. Are we doomed in this regard, or could there be a 4th wave? And what will it take for such a wave to occur? Because when we look, and you alluded to it briefly, but I think it's worth elaborating on. When you look at all the sentiments and the statements of the first 2 waves, you would never think that there could be a peace with Egypt that holds, a peace with Jordan that holds, and an expansion of that peace with the Gulfists, and under certain circumstances, probably also with Saudi Arabia. And yet, they happened. So what can we learn from that?
Yes, thank you, Chaim. So let me answer maybe the second one first, because it will lead me into talking about the first one. I think...
Before we answer the question,
Yeah.
I'm going to be chutzpah. We have 2 more minutes. So please ask a brief question, and we'll add it to your...
okay.
I just wanted to know your thoughts on Jordan, knowing that people on the ground are not very fond of their king. What do you think the future of Jordan will be?
Thanks. Okay, so with regard then, first of all, to Chaim's questions, and the second one first, I think that what we learn from looking at the trajectory of Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism, is that for the rapprochement to take place, of course Egypt is the important one, first of all, pan-Arabism had to be defeated. Otherwise, the intellectual rapprochement has never really happened, even to this day. Muhammad Haykal or whatever, the ones who still held to this view didn't like Israel all the way through their lives. It mattered less because the charisma and strength of their ideas were broken on the battlefield, not in the first instance, not in the university seminar room. And this was appropriate because pan-Arabism presented itself first and foremost as the way in which Arabs would win. The Arabs had lost, of course, in 48, and the idea was, but with these ideas, which will produce military governments, which will harvest the resources well, will create new armies, new states, which will then reverse the verdict of 1948. And in 1967, the verdict was not reversed. The same verdict was reissued. And as a result, Pan-Arabism was broken. And the political developments of the 70s followed on from this breaking. And I think also the rise of political Islam followed on from this breaking, because the collapse of Pan-Arabism left an empty space in which political Islam came. What I'm trying to say in all this is the following. I think that political Islam will need to be defeated, and first and foremost on the battlefield once again. It will need to comprehensively be demonstrated to its followers that it cannot bring what it promises to bring. It promises to bring dignity through victory. It won't bring dignity through victory because it will be defeated. But this has to happen first of all. Once this has happened comprehensively, then it will begin, I think, to decline. Having said that, let me just add a small caveat to that, which is that I think political Islam works with the prevailing sentiments of masses of people in the region in a way that Pan-Arabism never did. Pan-Arabism was a movement of elites and of officers, but political Islam really is a movement of the masses. Islam is tremendously powerful, as you know, in the spaces under discussion. Nevertheless, it can be broken and will be, first of all, on the battlefield, and then I think it will decline. Right now, it's impossible for us to imagine diplomatic rapprochements between Israel and something like political Islam. So perhaps it will decline and be replaced. But in any case, it must be first of all broken, and then this can open new possibilities. But physically, first of all, intellectually only later, I think. And regarding how we fight back, so I guess as I said, my answer to the first question is contained in my answer to the second. We will fight back right now at this moment, and when I say we, I mean the West, not only Israel, but Israel and its allies, most importantly the United States of America, first and foremost by defeating the current military mobilization of political Islam, which is taking place across the region in defense of or in support of Hamas in Gaza. Intellectually, of course, and this is no less vital given the broad political support for our enemies now in the heartlands of the West, an astonishing reality. What can I tell you? I have no simple or great solutions to give. I think that organizations like ISGAP, manifestations like the one in which we're currently taking part, the husbanding and centralizing of material and financial resources in support of this kind of struggle, to create publications, to fight the battle also inside academia, to finance departments which will teach the real story of the Middle East. This is a very long journey, but I don't think there are any shortcuts. It's clear. We know how you win an intellectual battle. It's easier to say, well, to actually do it is harder, but we know how it's done. It's done by this kind of husbanding of resources and putting them in the right direction and working on it. And I think we are engaged in that, all of us here in this room, and it's a long journey, but we know how it needs to be done. With regard to Jordan, yeah, I'm personally very worried about Jordan, and I can tell you that I was one of the people for many years who was not worried. As people used to say, Jordan is in danger and Jordan is it's unstable. And I would always say something like the following, which I don't completely now disagree with, but I need to caveat it. I used to say, yeah, the Hashemite monarchy always looks like it's in trouble. And in fact, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan has looked like it was in trouble and imminently was going to collapse, almost from the moment of its emergence. Right? Remember that during the period of Pan-Arabism, which we were discussing, the Hashemite monarchy in Jordan looked like a ridiculous anachronism. Everyone say, yeah, this stupid little British supporter, get rid of him and another officers' regime in Amman. But of course it never came. The Palestinians tried to take them on, they were defeated. So the Hashemite monarchy has always been stronger than it looks. And it has powerful friends, in spite of the language used by King Abdullah. It has powerful friends in Jerusalem as well as in Washington and in London. And this is important too. But I think that and a third thing which I always want to point out is that the population of Jordan, is Palestinian versus Bedouin. The population of Jordan is Sunni Arab Muslim, almost in its entirety, and this matters. And the wife of the king, of course, is Palestinian from Tulkarem, and that matters too. It means there is purchase by elements of the population. There is no sectarian divide. There is no ethnic divide of the kind which ripped apart Iraq or Syria or Lebanon. Having said all that, yes, I do think they're in trouble. I'm very worried. I've personally written about this. I was one of the first people to write about it in recent weeks in one of the newspapers I write for, about the fact that Jordan is now becoming a smuggling route for weaponry coming in from Syria into the West Bank. The Iranians and their friends are extremely keen to flood the West Bank with weaponry. They know that because of Israel's strong hold on the West Bank, from an intelligence and security point of view, they know that they can't really set up powerful militias with hierarchical leadership there. It's very difficult. But what they want to do is to get plenty of weaponry into the West Bank and then make it available to young guys who want to create a little militia which will do a few things before Israel crushes it. We saw this before October 7th, if you remember, in the summer of last year, with the Jenin Battalion and then the Lions Den in Nablus. This is all part of a process. Jordan is not managing to successfully address this, and the weaponry is coming in. We've written about some of the sourcing, is exactly how it's getting there, from Lebanon through Syria, through Jordan. And this is something which we have to press Jordan, I think, to begin to take care of. It's not something which they can afford also to be indifferent to. So yeah, this worries me, because usually I would say with regard to Jordan, whatever might look dangerous, the Jordanian state has a strong security hold on the country. And recently I've come to the conclusion that this may not quite now be the case anymore. So we will see. Sure.
So, Jonathan, on behalf of everybody,
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
everybody, enjoy your lunch, and we'll be back at 2:30. We're losing.